Stan, we're live.
Thank you, Larry. Today I am dressed in black, and I'm going to wear this black Little League hat, not because it has anything to do with Little League, but it's the only black hat I have, and we wear caps in the dugout. But as many of you know, the golden EIB microphone is silenced. Mr. Rush Limbaugh, my political hero. If Ted Williams was my baseball hero, Rush Limbaugh was my political hero. So may I ask you for a moment of silence? Rest in peace, Rush. A little later in the show, I'm going to give you my personal remembrances and tribute to Rush. I put it out on Twitter that were it not for Rush, I would not be the founder and CEO of a conservative think tank. It was he who, and I'll go into this in more detail, but it was he who taught me how to think and talk about conservatism. I'm just going to go through, in just a minute or two, we're going to bring on Professor Len Lardaro, but just a couple. I'm going to go into much more detail on Rush later, but I just wanted to share a few images with you right now. Here is a Washington Times summary. And it's true, he created conservative talk radio. In fact, many say he saved AM radio, which was floundering at the time. And he brought life to so many stations. Here he is, we remember almost a year ago, receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom, pinned on him by Melania Trump. And that picture says it best. Suffering from cancer, knowing his time is limited, but eternally optimistic. So I'm going to tell you my Rush Limbaugh story afterwards, but right now let's get back to business, which is also sad, maybe another reason to be dressed in black. So let's bring in our regular contributor, University of Rhode Island economics professor, Len Lardaro. Len, welcome back to In the Dugout. And I know you're a good sport. You wear caps on the show. What do you got for us today, Len?
So I got Vanderbilt. That's where my son did his residency, and I kind of like that. It's interesting school, so that's today and everything. So
yeah, great town down there in Nashville. I was there, about 5 or 6 years ago, and my son at URI played in a little tournament down at Vanderbilt. And
it's an amazing place. It really is.
Been to Nashville many times. It's a great city. Okay, just quickly, I don't know if you were a Rush Limbaugh fan, but any thoughts on his passing?
It's just sad, and you hate to see that. And that was not a particularly easy way to die. I mean, the lung cancer and things, and you could see physically the toll that it had taken. But I think he kept his attitude up, and I think he had good spirits, and that's important. I mean, there's not much else you can do and things. So, he passed gracefully, I guess you would say, if there's such a thing as a graceful passing. But that's something. He's someone who made a difference, certainly.
Yep, no question, he made a difference. We're going to talk more about it later. All right, let's get to your report. So, speaking of sad, you put out your monthly current conditions index, and we're looking at your December 2020 index here. Before we get into some of the specifics, I don't think, well, you and I might have talked this way on the air before. I don't think I've seen you write language like this before. You're not very happy with the state of the state, as it turns out, with our elected officials when it comes to our economy, are you?
No, and I haven't been, because a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And, we wasted 2008 and 9, the financial crisis. And right now, we have a crisis, and we have a lot of structural deficiencies. I mean, look at it, all the different surveys of business climate, we always come out either bottom or next to the bottom with all those different criteria. And that tells you a lot, that there's a lot of deficiencies here. And so what are we doing to plan our way out of this and to be a lot better and more competitive? I don't see much of anything.
All right, and before we get into that,
Yeah.
I want to make note of something you reference here that I've highlighted. Statistical deceivers in our state. We heard Governor Raimondo in her testimony to be confirmed at the Senate committee to be confirmed for United States Commerce Secretary. This, like you say, hide behind the quote low unemployment rate, the dropping unemployment rate that I don't even want to use the word achieved, because just like you say, that's a deceiving and misleading statistic, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an artificially low number. I mean, what they're doing, which makes perfect sense if you want to deceive people, is that when do you go from a double-digit unemployment rate to a very, very low unemployment rate? Usually because of a lot of job growth, robust economic activity. And so
Right.
people are going to naturally assume that about us. But what I think, the only one stating publicly is a very important fact, that even as of February of 2020, before the pandemic hit, we still had not returned to our
Right.
December 2006 level of employed Rhode Islanders. And so how did we get such a low unemployment rate? A decade-long drop in our labor force. And that's not the way you're supposed to do it. That limits growth. And that's why, as I noted, that we've been largely stuck at our 2015 level as far as real GDP goes.
Yeah, and as we've, I think, compared notes before, based on the research of Justin Katz from our center, we have a different index, the Jobs and Opportunity Index, that also cites the reduction. In fact, we set up our formula in that so that the decreasing labor force, which is a bad thing, does not make the unemployment rate look better, right? It's a weird backward kind of relationship. So our Jobs and Opportunity Index, likewise, we've been right with you in that. Okay, let's go back and look at your
my index too. What I do is, if the labor force goes down, that's a -1. If the unemployment rate goes down, that's a +1. They cancel. So I've got that covered too.
Good, beautiful. As it should be, But when Gina Raimondo just quotes the falling unemployment rate, she's hiding behind a false, deceptive statistic. Okay, so you mentioned we're stuck at 2016 levels. When you say wasted the crisis,
yes,
what do you mean by that?
We haven't used it as a way to shake things up and to look at our deficiencies and to try and minimize those or eliminate them, and to try and develop new areas or work with our strengths and make ourselves better, so that we can move from our status, and this is a term I had to make up. I've made up a lot of terms for Rhode Island over the years. FILO, first in, last out. So this time we weren't first in because everyone went down at the same time as economies shut down. But I'm very, sadly confident we're going to be among the last out of this. It's going to take 3 to 5 or even longer years to really get back to where we were. And as I noted, where we were wasn't much to write home about because we were largely stuck at the 2015 level.
And when you say waste the crisis, I think you're probably saying the same thing. We even had, I can't think of the great cartoonist, Charlie Hall. We even had him create a graphic for us, which I think you'll enjoy. So let me share that with you.
Yeah.
Because no matter what happens, pandemic, economic crisis or not, Rhode Island government officials just keep on fiddling that same old tax and spend tune, right? That's what they do. Right?
The state is being run exactly the same way it has been run for the last 30 or 40 years. The problem is the world changed dramatically. We're in a much less forgiving economic environment, but we keep doing things the same way. We're largely flying blind without in-house due diligence. Their decision-making is largely throwing darts and relying on the word should. Yes, this should work. It would work that way in Massachusetts. It doesn't work that way here. You think they'd learn, but there's another story there as far as publicity and that things for getting issues launched.
Now, let me scroll down to the bottom of here. And why don't you just explain to our viewers exactly what your index numbers said last month, if you want to reference anything here on the screen.
Yeah, what I did actually, if you look on the left there, normally I look to a year earlier and the current month, but because the pandemic started in February, I compared February to December of 2020. And the numbers are just scary. I mean, some of those, anything in red, the changes and percentage changes means those particular numbers did not improve compared to February. And the striking thing, if you look there at the bottom two rows, payroll employment, the number of Rhode Island jobs down, 9.1% compared to February. Resident employment, the number of employed Rhode Islanders down 7.7%. The problem with Rhode Island, we saw this in 08, 09, we fall very far and we dig a hole that's tough to get out of. And we don't have the kind of business climate and the pro-growth initiatives to really get us out of that. And that's part of what I was saying, that a crisis is a thing to waste. If you don't make yourself better, it's just more of the same. But I don't think we're going to have the same leeway this time that we had in 09. I think it's going to be much tougher for us to go along because there's been a lot of damage, a lot of changes with the loss of small business and other things. And what I didn't have space to mention is that as we have fairly large budget deficits, balancing the budget, which we have to do constitutionally, is going to slow us down even further on top of a non-competitive business climate.
Now you make a joke or a point of not calling them legislative leaders because you're saying they're not leading, they're legislative officials. You say it's not leadership, it's denial.
Yeah.
And you call it endogenous mediocrity. Yeah. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, what I was saying is that what our elected officials, who I refuse to refer to as leaders, constantly do, they say, well, you're being negative, and they dismiss it based on that. And that's not leadership, that's denial. And so the sum total of all of that leads to the fact that our economic performance for several decades now has been very, very mediocre. Endogenous means it's part of the whole system that we work in. And so the way that we do things and don't do things we should do, that's led us to a mediocrity that's part of our culture that unfortunately feeds on itself. If we had an organizational diagram, you'd see that we have the right boxes, but our arrows are all messed up. And we can fix that, but I don't see any movement in that direction, to be honest with you.
So let me ask you this. Let's move away from a report and just talk a little more generally here. So Rhode Island's going to have soon, its two most important legislative leader changes. We're going to have a new governor in McKee, and we do already have a new speaker in Shekarchi. Do you have any firsthand knowledge or reason to believe that McKee more than Raimondo or Shekarchi more than Mattiello might not be so endogenously mediocre?
Well, as far as McKee goes, I like his emphasis on small business a lot. And I hope we really run with that, because approximately 90% of Rhode Island's employees are with firms of 30 or fewer employees. So we do have a lot of small businesses, and we need to really work with them instead of always going after the really big businesses and buy their jobs and those kinds of things. And, the other thing too, though, and I really avoided making comments on the governor's record or something, because, in this state, the governor is only the third most powerful state. And so the governor usually takes the heat for what the legislature fails to do.
Right.
And I'm just not going to play that game. So I'm hoping the legislature wakes up, and we're going to have to make some major league changes to our budget to balance, because you and I spoke a couple of times ago, that why such a small budget deficit? Well, they charged off some things to the pandemic, and you can't do that anymore unless that bigger package were to get passed. So, if we've got big budget deficits on top of a normally slow recovery, that's going to just make it even more difficult.
It looks like federally, there is going to be massive bailouts to states to be used to plug budget holes. It looks like the money, the printing press in DC is going to go crazy. And it looks like the money that's going to come to states is going to be far more than the hundreds, however many hundreds you think, 300, 500 millions of dollars lost because of the pandemic. So let me propose it to you this way. If there's excess money, well, I think to your original point, especially when we're down after the pandemic,
Yeah.
if we're having that money, let's use it to create a better business environment. Let's change things up, maybe lower taxes and maybe create a better business environment so we can grow our economy rather than just spend it on the same old things. Would that be kind of your
Yeah,
point?
and I can even refine it a point
Okay.
further, because one of the things that's been going on, they're kind of sneaking, our government sneaking, taking a little bit more taxation on services and taxation on services, but they don't earmark it, which is what they should do. And I don't think our elected officials really understand, although they say they do, the distinction between consumption-oriented spending, which has a little buzz and it just fades out, or investment-oriented spending, which
Right.
generates long-term benefits. We should be earmarking, if we're going to tax services more, earmark specifically for investment oriented uses only. But that's never going to happen. You feed the general fund and it just keeps going and going and feeding on itself. That's part of our endogenous mediocrity. There's just no way of controlling that.
And that's what the left doesn't get. They think that if they were to craft an economic formula, it would be 100% consumer spending. When you and I know that capital investment is really the foundation.
Yeah.
Investing in businesses, investing in, that kind of stuff is really the foundation. You can't have people spending good money unless they have good paying jobs, unless there are good performing companies, and unless you have good investors in those companies, right? So it's the horse before the cart kind of thing. Capital investment is just as critical, or would you say more critical than consumer spending?
Much more critical, but it's kind of deaf ears upstate. But look at the bond issues. I mean, I would only back or support anything that's investment oriented, maybe the infrastructure, but some of the other things right now you just hold off on. We can maybe do that later, because our capacity to support debt is not what it was.
Right.
And coming out of this, if we have large deficits to fight, and it's still not clear, whether we will or not, but they're going to be more than we want, it's going to slow us down. And so I'm kind of worried about a credit rating. With all the tragic deaths from the pandemic, we're going to have negative population growth in 2020, which virtually assures we're going to lose a congressional seat. And so these are not things to celebrate. These are not good things. But when we can't fix the congressional seat, but when you have a largely stagnant population, you don't have a lot of jobs created, that's what you're going to get. And we've got to change that. And I don't think we can wait another 10 years to do something. I think we really are going to have to start doing something now, or the world's going to start to blow up in our face.
Yeah, I agree. And that change would include, and this is an argument we've made, so the left wants everything to be worker based, right? As part of their whole attack on wealth, us versus them, the proletariat versus the rich elites, or whatever the right word, communist words are for that. Sorry, I'm not up on my communist lingo. But they focus on the worker, more rights for workers, more wages for workers, more paid time off for workers. And almost all of those things are at the expense of the job producing employer. So the left tends to look at workers, and we tend to look at the employer. Agree with that kind of setup?
And remember too, that because we're such a high cost state, if our cost of doing business were lower, businesses could afford to profitably give higher rates of pay. And so that's the whole thing, is that we look at one thing and we kind of forget our business climate. No serious person, to my mind, has ever alleged that Rhode Island has a competitive business climate. And so we act as if we're fine, and we're not, and we just go along our merry way. These are the things, we can't sustain this a lot longer.
We're not competing in this state. When I hear legislative, again, I caught myself, I can't use the word leaders. When I see legislative officials say, well, Massachusetts raised their minimum wage, so we've got to raise our minimum wage to stay competitive. We're not competing for workers right now. We're competing for employers, right?
They have an adequately skilled labor force. We don't. And that's
that too.
Little things like that. But that's
little thing like that. No education. Yeah. Okay.
They try and make it like, well, what works in Massachusetts will work here. And a lot of the times it doesn't. It's not even close. And so But, they live in a linear world. Everything is believed to be independent of everything else. And it's not. If you're going to raise the minimum wage, it's got to be dependent on the skills of your workforce.
And wouldn't it make Rhode Island more competitive to have a lower cost of doing business when it comes to people who want to invest that capital money in starting businesses if there was a lower cost of labor? Wouldn't that make us more competitive to be lower in Massachusetts when it came to something like minimum wage?
Look at the whole tax system and things. Are we really attuned to a service-based economy?
Right.
And I don't really think we are. We just kind of leave things alone and assume it's going to keep going and going and going, like that battery commercial. It's just not going to happen.
All right, so back to Dan McKee. He's got some big issues right away to deal with that are going to tell us whether, yes, listen, as lieutenant governor, he is, at least it's one of the enumerated powers, not a power, but enumerated duties. He's head of the Small Business Council or something like that. So, and he has been holding regular meetings and he talks a lot about it. I'm not aware of anything he's actively lobbied for or moved through that would help small businesses. But he's going to have his chance now as governor, and he's got three big issues that I've listed here. I'd like you to take them one by one.
Yeah.
We've got this new Transportation and Climate Initiative gas tax, which would just put more pressure, downward pressure on businesses, raise prices, not only for consumers, but on other products. We've got a wealth tax that the unions are pushing to tax that wealth that could otherwise be invested in capital and invested in companies. And he's got a major minimum wage hike that's going to be probably coming his way. I mean, does your index A account for any of that, and does B, just as an economics professor, what are your thoughts on each of those three
things? It would reflect that indirectly, but this is certainly the minimum wage nationally is crazy, $7.25 an hour. We're 11 and a quarter, but if you're going to raise it, you got to be careful how rapidly you do it and to what level. But this is not a great time because who's that going to hurt the most? The very small businesses that are hanging on by their fingernails, and that's my worry. That if we start losing them in even larger numbers, they get replaced by chains that aren't as good or as personal, even if aggregate income doesn't change much. And these are the kind of things we have to address. But the point is, where's the systematic analysis behind each of those measures?
Right.
There is no due diligence.
It's just narrative, right? It's just a
narrative. Be good. It should work. Well,
right.
I think that we need to rely a lot more on the word should. And, the phrase I made up for that, we have due presumption because we don't have due diligence. That doesn't get you very far.
All right.
And you see all the things blow up in our face.
So you agree that a rapid rise in the minimum wage could have negative economic impact?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly have some positive effects, but it's going to have a bunch of negative effects, especially as you're coming out of a pandemic. But again, what you should do is try and find a series of measures that fit together and that do a purpose instead of here's one. Here's another.
Right. I mean, wealth tax, is that would a wealth tax increasing the tax on the wealthiest Rhode Islanders help or hurt our economy?
Well, it's not going to necessarily help because you're competing with other states. And let's just say we don't have the most pristine reputation, to say the very least. And so if you start doing that, then people are going to be looking elsewhere even more than they do now. Short term, with people existing here, you might start to rack up the revenue, but then over the long term, people make adjustments. And I just think that we need to be much more attractive to wealth if you're going to start raising taxes on wealth. And again, here we are. This is the way we've always done it. And that just
this is what always happens. Just like you were saying earlier, people leave our state.
Yeah,
because they can vote with their feet, and they don't have to put up with high taxes. There are plenty of other states with lower taxes, and we've seen that happen in New York. We've seen it happen in Connecticut. We've seen it happen in countries where they've taxed the wealth. It's caused a massive outflow of people, and they've had to repeal the wealth taxes because they just don't work. Like you said, it gives them a short-term high with some revenue, but in the long term, it guts their states.
Yeah, we just need to have a much better defined niche. We need to be much more competitive. Then you can start thinking about those, but you don't just throw a number out. You have to do the research and the due diligence to see what number would work. How would we target it? What would be sensible? It's not like, here's a number. It's just like throwing a dart, and we got to cut that out.
All right, how about something like the TCI gas tax? Not only in my view would that cut into family budgets and business budgets that use vehicles for any purpose, but it also will raise the price of any goods, of the many goods that are transported by truck that use diesel and whatnot. So that's not going to help our economy either, is it?
Well, we got to be careful because, I'm not ruling out that the courts are going to say, you guys can't just tax trucks. If you're going to do that, you have to tax trucks and cars.
The tolls from a few years ago you're
Yeah,
talking
you know what I
about.
mean?
Yeah.
And so that wouldn't be such a swift thing if we're, now we've got to pay taxes on gasoline, all that stuff, and then on top of that. So again, it's a question of timing, among other things, and doing the research, what's the right level, whatever, instead of here's a number, let her rip. Yeah.
All right, final question, because I know you've got something to do at 4 o'clock. If you have time for one more question.
Sure, go ahead.
So I'm gonna look at the Go Local Prov. I know they headline your report every week where you talk about the endogenous mediocrity, and you list 3 people there. One of those people is Gina Raimondo. Now you talk about legislative officials, not leaders. You put Gina Raimondo in that same category, and if whether you do or not, what does it say to you that a governor of an economy that you and I both agree is so failed is about to become Commerce Secretary for the United States of America?
Well, I mean, if you look at her credentials, they're amazing. I mean, on paper, just incredible. And so, and apparently she
Politically.
very much impressed the president and things. So we always knew she was going to DC. The only question was when, and this is something she just can't pass up. So hopefully, because the governor is only the 3rd most powerful person and largely a visionary here, that she'll be able to accomplish more in DC than she was able to do here, because it's not just her, it's just the way we're set up. Rhode Island is not set up for success in the post-manufacturing era. That's just a basic fact.
All right. Professor Len Lardaro, University of Rhode Island economist, your current conditions index, not looking good, endogenous mediocrity, he says.
Yeah.
Thanks again for joining us on In the Dugout. We'll see you next month.
Okay, thanks for having me. Take care.
Thanks, Professor. So I guess another reason we're wearing black today. Larry, I see, I think I know what you're going to say, but you have another sad update for us, right?
Absolutely. More bad news on In the Dugout today. Unfortunately, YouTube has decided to censor the chat function for our video for the 2nd day in a row. Right now, we're still able on the show to get our message out, but our viewers are being censored. And, when I think about this issue, they have the right to be educated on this. They have the right to ask questions. That's what America was founded on. And YouTube has decided to penalize them for watching conservative media. It's extremely upsetting. I'm furious over this, and I hate to have to come on and share the bad news.
So our viewers can't engage in chat.
Exactly. And it's a big part of our show for them to ask questions, and they can't do that. I'm very, very angry.
And worse than that, I saw in yesterday's show, as I clicked on it, there was some anti-QAnon message as if we have anything to do with QAnon. So somehow YouTube has associated us apparently with QAnon.
Stan, we're a serious think tank. We're doing serious issues. We're not involved in any conspiracies. We're talking about mainstream conservative ideas here, and we're bringing in experts, senators, professors, epidemiologists. We're bringing people facts about the issue so they can make informed decisions. And YouTube apparently doesn't like that.
Huh.
Sorry to share.
We don't like YouTube.
Maybe not. Sorry to share the bad news.
All right. Well, I enjoy reading the comments and responding to them sometimes. So right now, you're just going to have to listen. Although, Larry, why don't you post, if you want to share your screen later, if somebody would like to phone in, since they can't chat, we can at least put up the graphic of how they can call in if they'd like to make a comment or ask a question. All right, so why don't you do that? In the meantime, I'm going to move on to my
Absolutely.
tribute to Rush Limbaugh, and then after that, I will do an expose. I don't know, expose. I don't know. I'm going to rip something that was in the paper yesterday in the Boston Globe. I talked about a little bit at the end of my show yesterday, with the left-wing media just praising the failed and dishonorable impeachment effort that David Cicilline was a House manager and leader for. So I'm gonna get into that a little bit later on too. But first, a little bit more on Rush Limbaugh. As I said earlier, if Ted Williams was my baseball hero, Rush Limbaugh was my political hero. He was, sad to say the word was, I wish I could say is, an unapologetic conservative, which is what I try to be. And it's because of Rush. I tuned into his show today because I've been waiting to hear if he's going to come back on. And of course, we knew he'd missed the last 7 or 8 shows. We didn't know he was this close to passing. And instead of Rush coming on the show at 12:07 today, his wife, Catherine, came on live and announced the horrible news. She held it together. I didn't. Rush was very important in my life. What he stood for, he was a proud and unwavering patriot. He always talked and believed in the greatness of America. In fact, I even wonder if that's where Make America Great Again, from Trump came from, because Rush kept talking about the greatness of America. He's been doing this since 1988, folks. Rush Limbaugh stood in his truth every day of his life, never to be moved off of his truth. And whether your truth is conservative or liberal, libertarian or progressive, doesn't matter. We only have one thing in the end, and that's our integrity and our intellectual honesty. And that means you stand in your truth, whatever that is. And you stand firmly in it. You don't let any politically correct, woke, or conservative, or any wind, I should say, move you off of that. I went to Harvard in the late 70s, graduated in 1980. I gotta say, I got fair, if not even conservative economics classes. So that began my conservative thinking. And then during my 8 years of pro ball from 1980 to 1988, it was the Reagan years. Well, 1987, I should say. The Reagan years. And that further developed a little bit my conservatism. And then in 1988, Rush Limbaugh came around. August 1st, 1988. Now, that happens to be the exact same day and year that my oldest son was born. August 1st, 1988 was the date of Rush Limbaugh's first broadcast. 30, almost 33, 32 and a half years ago. And it was because of Rush that I started to get even more interested in conservative thinking. And I ordered a publication. I don't know if any of you ever remember. It was called the Conservative Chronicles. It was in print. Back then there was no, media, internet. And it was a weekly publication. I think I paid $50 a year for it back then. 50. I don't know what I paid. But it was a weekly print publication of all the great conservative writers, from William F. Buckley to Thomas Sowell to Mona Sharon to, you name Cal Thomas and all of them. And I ate it up. I just read it and devoured it. And I listened to this Rush Limbaugh guy, but I wasn't sure what to make of him. Now, Rush Limbaugh was a conservative, obviously, unabashed. The left hated him. We'll get into that in a second. But I still wasn't sure whether to trust him or not. And then came Desert Storm in 1990. George Bush the elder. And if you're old enough to remember, Saddam Hussein was talking about how there would be a bloodbath, how the American blood would flow from Kuwait down the whatever river into Baghdad. And the national media was going crazy. How can Americans go into this war, suffer such great losses to defend a country like Kuwait? It's going to be terrible. It's going to be terrible. And this was the narrative as we were building and obviously preparing for war. But Rush Limbaugh kept saying, folks, listen to me. Don't listen to the media. I don't know what the number was, but he said something like, do you have any, this is Rush's practical side, right? This has nothing to do with conservative or liberal or anything like that. This was how Rush was practical. He said, do you have any idea what $800 billion a year of military spending gets you? Do you have any idea? He said, the other side, the media is trying to tell you this is going to be, 2-3 year battle. He says, folks, this is going to be over in 3 days. You have any idea the kind of military power we can project on a small country like Iraq, whose whole GDP isn't even as much as what we spend every year on military? And you know what? He was right. I think it took less than 3 days. And that's when I really became a Rush Limbaugh fan and became a big, because it wasn't just conservatism, it was common sense. That was a common sense statement that America, the greatest military power in the world, with all the spending, a little country like, no matter how crazy a guy like Saddam Hussein was, and no matter how much of an army he tried to put together, are you kidding me? It's going to somehow stand up to American might? And it didn't. And Rush was right. What I want to do with you now is just share a few screenshots of some tweets as a tribute to Rush. The first one from his, I don't know if it was forever, but his longtime producer, Bo Snerdley. I've actually talked to Bo Snerdley on the phone a few times. God bless you, Rush. I love you. Always and forever. This is the man who, he's like Larry the, imagine if Larry the Liberty Guy and I were doing this for every day for 3 hours a day for 32 years.
I'd be lost, Dad. I'd be lost.
Yeah, this is what Bo Snerdley was to Rush Limbaugh and vice versa. So we start with that. Here is my tweet today. And as I explained to you earlier, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be head of a think tank, because I never would have had the confidence to talk about conservative values to the extent where I could head a think tank, win approval of a board of directors, and raise money if I couldn't articulate the conservative values that I wanted to try to advance in this state. And it was Rush Limbaugh who taught me how to articulate that. So it is, as I say, continue to say, it is my goal now to continue Rush's mission, to inform Americans, in our case, Rhode Islanders, of the unbelievable God-given optimism and benefits of freedom that this great country offers. This great, great country, at least as conceived, not in practice, unfortunately. And that's because, as opposed to what really is the crushing hopelessness of big government liberalism. I believe that with all my heart. That's my truth. And my pledge to you is, like Rush Limbaugh stood in his truth, I'm going to stand in my truth every day as I work with you and try to reach out to Rhode Island. Dinesh D'Souza, the greatest, the Muhammad Ali of radio, absolutely. Candace Owens, another great lady, great freedom fighter, never be replaced. Truth, truth, reality, fake news, big these days. I believe what Rush Limbaugh spoke was truth. Bill O'Reilly, another powerful man, figure weighs in. Yes, made a huge difference in this country. Not only empowered me, but tens of millions of other Americans to be comfortable with our conservatism against the media and the left who conspire to put us down. Just like YouTube is on our show, not allowing you, our viewers, to chat on this show. Now, I've heard someone say that Walter Winchell in the 1930s and 40s might have even had a bigger listening audience than Rush Limbaugh. But Bill O'Reilly calls him the most successful radio broadcaster in history. And he agrees with me that in Rush, the dangerous left-wing corporate media machine. There's a tweet from Diamond and Silk. They got to meet the great man. I didn't. But then there are the others who are reveling in Rush Limbaugh's death. Can you believe that? There's actually a hashtag out there called Good Riddance. You can believe that. And the reason I show you this tweet, remember I said earlier, the eternal optimism and great benefit of freedom. Well, this right here from the left, this is I don't even remember how did I term it? The crushing destruction. How did I say it? Let's go back. The crushing hopelessness of big government liberalism is expressed right here in this tweet by some crazy left-winger reveling in the death of Rush Limbaugh. This is the difference, folks, between we as common sense conservatives and they as pretend to live in a never land for liberals. I mean, that was his term. We use the word progressive a lot. Rush always called it liberalism, was what he was fighting about. I was gonna, Rush had a way of using parody and humor to make his point. He had some tremendous production talent, and they put together some parody songs, and he had some tremendous sayings. And I was gonna ask you today to write in the comments what your favorite Rushisms were. I'll go through a few of mine here in a second. But the left hated him because he made fun of them. It was humor. Rush never mistreated. I mean, the things Rush has been called, the racist, the misogynist, he made fun of it. That's what political humor is. And he was a political humorist, in addition to an awesome commentator. So here are some of my favorite Rushisms. The first one is especially poignant. They used to say, the Rush Limbaugh show, talent on loan from God. That's all of us, folks. In Rush's case, God has taken that talent back this morning. It was on loan. I think his most famous one was half my brain. I do this show with half my brain tied behind my back. Yeah, he did like to promote himself in a fun way, not like a Donald Trump way. He coined the phrase, we hear mainstream media and all that. He called them the drive-by media. He coined that phrase. What that meant is the media would just like people driving by a crash, right? When you're on the highway, you can't help but look. but you don't get to really see much, right? With all the cars there, all the commotion, you got to keep moving, you can't stop, and so you just create some picture based on the quick look you get. Well, that's what he says that the mainstream media did. They would look at it, they would look at a story, make a quick snap judgment based on their bias, based on the little bit that they're aware of, and they put out a false headline. Now that drive-by media, Donald Trump then, termed the fake media, but it was the same thing. Rush was onto this 32 years ago, the drive-by media. The term that really drove the left crazy was feminazis, when the women's movement was at its core and was at its beginning. I don't know if it was at its beginning, but it was at a point that at least was beginning, really started to get noticed. And we're women, we're feminine, and we're in your face. Remember that? Do you remember that little parody song he did? Obviously parody. And again, Rush was onto something. It is, the women's movement now is largely the movement that's fueling the progressive left movement. If you think about it, just look nationally and locally. And then maybe his best song was the Ted Kennedy song, to the tune "I'm a Wanderer." I'm Ted Kennedy. Yeah, I'm Ted Kennedy. Around. So again, parody, humor. So Rush Limbaugh, it's going to be really interesting to see what they do with his show. I mean, the Rush Limbaugh show for 32 years has been a staple of not only so many people's lives, but of so many radio stations' lineup. What is going to happen? Is there anybody out there who can step into those shoes across all those syndicated networks and shows throughout the country and throughout the world? Or is it going to become fragmented and, some mix of local shows? I mean, there are some good people out there nationally, Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens and others. I'd like to see a young person get in, because I think we need to reach young people with have them understand the optimism of capitalism and the freedom, as opposed to the crushing hopelessness of big government liberalism. But there's going to be a lot of ratings losses. There might even be some radio stations that close. Again, Rush Limbaugh, many believe, saved AM radio. And not only did he achieve enormous wealth, but radio stations, the advertisers they were able to bring in were enormous. I mean, he had an audience, some say 15, 20 million people a day. How do you replace that economically? And I'm not just talking about from a conservative point of view. I'm talking about from an economic point of view. How do radio stations replace that kind of programming? We'll find out. They're not going to be able to. No one's going to be able to fill those shoes. Someone may step in them, but we'll see. All right, I want to spend the last. Oh, I see Larry is here. Larry, what do you got for me?
Yeah, we got our friend Roland on the line. Do you want him now or in a minute?
Oh, let's bring on Roland.
Roland, unmute yourself.
Roland, welcome back to In the Dugout. Were you a Rush Limbaugh fan, and your thoughts on him?
Roland, hit *6 on your phone to unmute yourself.
All right. How do you want to play it, Mr. Producer?
Well, let's keep going, and we'll try to get Roland any minute.
All right. Because I'm going to get into a whole nother topic here. But we'll go back for Roland. We'll go back. So in the spirit of Rush Limbaugh, who was an eternal critic of the drive-by media, I'm going to do a little expose exposing a drive-by media piece that was just ridiculous to me in yesterday's Boston Globe. Now, I'm not here to pick on a person, but I got to mention the person's name. I'm going to talk more about the paper. But the Boston Globe has a writer that covers Rhode Island, Dan McGowan. Dan McGowan used to be a reporter here in Rhode Island, but as many of you know, the Boston Globe now has a Rhode Island edition, and he puts out a column. I don't know if you call it a column, but he puts out an email. Dan McGowan does for the Boston Globe every day, called Roadmap RI, or Roadmap. Maybe it's just Roadmap. I can't remember, but yesterday's really troubled me, where he just gave unfettered, I would call it mindless praise, just like a drive-by media would, to Rhode Island Congressman David Cicilline, and portrayed him as a hero for his impeachment efforts. In the United States Congress. The title of McGowan's piece was that Congressman Cicilline has no regrets about taking on the former president, and that Cicilline has been largely praised for laying out a compelling case that Donald Trump incited the January 6th insurrection. Are you kidding me? A good journalist would not just do a puff piece like that. A good journalist would ask, okay, do you have regrets? And Cicilline will give his answer. But a good journalist would then say, well, do you have regrets that you stubbornly and dishonestly move forward with this incitement charge? Which means spur of the moment, if you incite something, when the FBI and everybody else for the last week or two has been, the FBI says, and every major news outlet left and right has been reporting that the attacks and the violence were pre-planned and therefore could not have been incited? Do you regret that you would move forward with such a dishonest trial? That would have been a question to ask. Or, even after you move forward, do you regret that you and your team falsified evidence, manipulated video, manipulated social media images to try to bolster your case? In Cicilline's case, even one piece of evidence he spoke so proudly of had to later be withdrawn by his team because it was false and could not be substantiated. I wonder if he has any regrets about that. But no, the media just dutifully sticks their heads in the sand about that kind of stuff. The Boston Globe does, and Dan McGowan does, and just praises Cicilline for laying out a compelling case. It was a false case. McGowan goes on to quote Mitch McConnell, who actually voted to acquit Trump, but blasted him on the floor. And of course, he quotes Mitch McConnell. He finds the one turncoat who stabbed Trump in the back now that he's out of office. But he didn't put quotes from any of the other senators, Ted Cruz or House of Representatives, Matt Gaetz or Jim Jordan. If you're going to do a balanced story, wouldn't you include perspectives from both sides? But when you're part of the dishonest drive-by media, no, you don't do that. He goes on to write, McGowan, in the Boston Globe, that Cicilline said, I knew I'm paraphrasing here, I knew we probably weren't going to get enough votes to convict them, but there was a part of me that always hoped that we could. Especially when more Republicans were critical of Trump's defense team. Well, if Dan McGowan knew anything about the story, he only critiqued him on the first day when Trump's defense team chose to talk and not use their prepared speech. But in the next 2 days, the Trump team destroyed Cicilline's team, destroyed them. They exposed the manipulated and falsified evidence. They exposed that the FBI itself says that this was pre-planned, therefore, parentheses, could not have been incited. Now, my views what happened on January 6th, the violence, the break-ins, any physical violence, criminal activity, absolutely. Absolutely. And I hope prosecutions are swift, and I hope justice is swift. But the left seems to think that if you don't agree that Donald Trump incited violence, we still don't know exactly who planned it. We know there was Antifa involved. We know there were some right-wing elements involved in the planning. We haven't seen the full arrest list yet. At least I haven't. So do I, but they seem to think that if you don't think Trump is guilty of incitement, that somehow we're okaying the violence and criminal activity that took place that day. We are not. One does not mean the other. There could have been criminal activity. We know there was planned criminal activity, and that could have happened, and looks like it did happen without it being Donald Trump's direct fault. That's the truth. The left in Never Never Land, it's both. If you deny Trump's guilt, then you condone the criminal activity. False. That's Never Never Land, drive-by media, fake news. So does, another question you could have asked when you're asking if you regretted going against Trump, did you regret falsifying the evidence? Cicilline. That question wasn't asked. So this is why even on the right, the right media, the alternate media on the right was painting this false story of insurrection acts and military coups or stuff like that. I mean, you can't automatically believe anything you read in the media anymore. This is why you must stand in your truth. You must stand in it, and you must not be lazy. You must not be drive-by. You must not look at a headline or look at a first paragraph and jump to a conclusion. You got to read the story. You can compare it with other stories, and you got to make sense of it yourself, because the drive-by media on the left or the right aren't going to give it to you. We here on In the Dugout are going to give you thoughtful analysis and at least the full, well thought out truth as we see it. We will never not stand our ground in order to defend any person or any organization. We've been critical of left and right. That's how we will stand in our truth. So here's proof of the, this is a tweet from one of my social media antagonists. I don't know who this Mr. Q is. I don't know if that's his real name or not, but you can see that because we don't think Trump was guilty, that we were just fine that the criminal activity happened that day, and therefore we are discussing. Now, as you can also see here, I challenged Dan McGowan. I'll challenge, that's a bad word. I invited Dan McGowan to come on this show. I want to ask him about his one-sided coverage, his kiss-up coverage to David Cicilline, but crickets, nothing from Dan McGowan. It's pretty common that on talk shows, members of the media come on to discuss stories they write. Dan McGowan didn't have the courage to do that. There's so much false information out there about that whole January 6th day. Here's one right here. This is, the officer that was supposedly hit in the head with a fire extinguisher. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. He died of a stroke. His brother admitted so. And just breaking today, we found out that an Antifa member who was in there dressed up as a Trumpster, with a Trump hat on. I don't have that picture right now. Was in there taking pictures, was actually paid by CNN and NBC. And yet they want you to believe that Trump incited it when the drive-by media and Antifa were conspiring to be part of this thing way ahead of time. Does David Cicilline, our congressman, have any regrets about that? That much of the hysteria over January 6th, as awful as it was, as criminal as it was, that much of the hysteria, just like we're seeing with COVID, is a media-driven hoax? The hysteria, not the event, the hysteria surrounding it. So we'll conclude today's show, at least I will, pledging to continue in my small way compared to the great man himself, to continue Rush Limbaugh's mission. As I said earlier, to inform Rhode Islanders and Americans about the true benefits of America's constitutionally granted freedoms, God-given freedoms, and how the big government liberalism just leads to nothing but crushing hopelessness and dependency and class warfare. The conservative message, Rush Limbaugh's message, was one of unity, as much as his critics tried to tell you otherwise. The progressive left, big government liberal agenda is by nature divisive. When we have to take from here, this group of people, in order to give it to that group of people, that is necessarily divisive. When we give certain people rights by infringing on others people's rights, that is necessarily, by definition, divisive. And it's hopeless. There's no way out. So that is my quest today. Rest in peace, Rush Limbaugh, my political hero. Jesus, #1 hero. My father, #2 hero and mother. Tied for second. Ted Williams, my baseball hero, sports hero. And Rush Limbaugh, my political hero. Tomorrow we'll have Dr. Andrew Bostomon for all things COVID. And in the first half of our show, we'll be talking with Representative David Place from the Burrillville area to put in some anti-corporate welfare legislation that we're interested to learn more about. So rest in peace, Rush Limbaugh. We'll see you tomorrow on In the Dugout.